as many of you know, I aspire to be an old man. My favorite radio station is, in fact, what everyone has NPR on it. And as such, one of my favorite radio programs on NPR is, it's actually new to Ohio, but it's been going for a while. It's called the Moth. And it is a recording of different performances that have been done in a couple of little shops around the nation. There's one in New York, one in Chicago, and one in LA. And the tagline of the Moth is "True stories told live on stage without notes," because everyone has a story to tell. And the story I'd like to tell you is about how I became a hardened sinner when I was 9 years old. My grandfather wanted to teach me how to fish. So it was the late summer. We arranged a trip, and the two of us rumbled north in his old VW Vanagon. And it took about 5 hours to go about 120 miles. Now, this grandpa was, you know, I loved him, but he was a mean old SOB. He had lost part of his hearing in 1 year, all of his hearing in 1 year due to a childhood illness, and we had a hard time talking as I drove north. And he was kind of crotchety, but he had this headset that he put on, and I held a microphone over at the passenger seat, and we would talk, and the conversation hit a lull, and he said, "Huh," pointing to the windshield. He said, "What do you think was the last thing to go through that bug's head?" "I don't know, Grandpa, what?" "His anus." This continued, and we got to the fishing hole later that afternoon, and this was August, so it was warm outside, but the fishing hole was still quite cold. I was pretty skinny as a kid, skinnier than Brigham. But he didn't have waders that would fit a child my size, and so he just told me to cowboy up and plunked me in the river, handed me a rod, and we started fishing. We caught several fish, and he wasn't really into the whole catch and release style of fly fishing. So as we caught the fish, he had a lead-filled billy club attached to his waders that he would use to crush the fish's head after we caught him. I didn't have a billy club, and so he told me, "Just break its back with your hands." Fishing rapidly was losing its allure. We wrapped up, and we took our catch, got back in the van, and drove a little way to a nearby campground, and had a nice supper of pork and beans, and then went to bed for the night. Little did I know the terror that awaited me the next day. God had me in his scope and was about to pull the trigger. The next morning we woke up and immediately started cooking breakfast. We started frying up some of the trout fillets from the night before. I was 9. I had never had fresh grilled trout, and I haven't had it since. I picked slowly at this fish and didn't eat much of it. And my grandpa, after cooking the fish, turned in the small van and started fiddling with this tall, strange-looking pot that had a clear bubble on the top, and the clear bubble would occasionally flash brown, making these strange, gurgling noises. I kept picking at my fish. It became mauled. After a moment or two, he turned and he grabbed a mug and he poured me a cup and he said, "Here's some sugar if you want it too." I was 9. Of course I wanted sugar. I took a sip of the drink and it became clear that Grandpa couldn't even cook drinks very well. became a little passable, and so I started ignoring the trout altogether. And then the drink became a little bad again, so I added some more sugar. And this process repeated itself until the point that the sugar wasn't dissolving anymore. And I just had this dark cup of brown swill swimming over this bed of sugar. And at that point, my grandfather, sitting across the table from me, finally paused and looked up at me. He said, "What? You gonna be a damn Mormon brat and not drink your coffee either?" I had no idea. I was 9. He was my grandpa. He was supposed to be watching out for me and protecting me. But all of a sudden, I knew that I had become one of the vilest of sinners. I attended all of my primary life. And I knew from Sister Purple Hair that our bodies were a temple. Would I want, how would I feel if someone had spray painted the Salt Lake Temple? I would feel horrible. That's what you're doing. Sister Purple Hair had told me. That's what you're doing if you don't obey the word of wisdom. That's what you're doing if you don't obey the law of chastity, Bryce. And here I was pouring the filth straight in. Breakfast was over. We went and fished the rest of the day. And I killed more fish. And thankfully it was over. We drove home, and all I could think of was how vile I had become. I knew that I was a sinner now, but I didn't want anyone else to know this. And as we drove home, plans began formulating in my head. You know, life was going to be relatively straightforward until it came to sacrament meeting. I had been taught. I listened in those primary lessons. And I knew that to take the sacrament unworthily was to damn yourself even more. And so I, however, was a cultured kid at this point. I had not only been and seen David Copperfield performing, I had performed magic on stage at a ward talent show. I knew all about this, so as the tray was passed, I would take the bread and palm it. It was simple. I could then just stuff the sacred emblem in my pocket and dispose of it later. The trick came a few moments later. The water's only an ounce or so, but it's a liquid ounce. You can't just palm that and dispose of it later. And my father, a physician, he had the eyes of an eagle. He could tell if my little paper cup had not been empty. I knew this. And so I knew I had to put the cup to my lips and drink it, or at least allow it to enter my mouth. I would not swallow, however. I could either, at that point, hold it in my mouth and go into the hall after the sacrament was over, run the fountain, and allow this damning water to straight into my mouth. Or, being a limber child, I could simply assume the most reverent of poses and let the water spill onto my knee. Because my father, who could see that ounce spilling out of its cup, would never notice the enlarging wet spot on my khaki. This continued for 3 years. It really was pretty straightforward, but I became aware of a snag that was soon approaching. At 12, of course, the young men are invited to obtain the Aaronic priesthood. To do so, they need to recite articles of faith, piece of cake, but they also needed to pass a personal priesthood interview with the bishop. I resolved I would not lie. I entered the interview, and it was smooth sailing until that cursed last question. Bryce, is there anything else in your life that would keep you from receiving the Aaronic priesthood? Yes, Bishop. I don't keep the word of wisdom. I can still hear the bishop laughing.